Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife are set to make their first court appearance in New York, days after both were captured in a highly choreographed U.S. strike in capital Caracas. This says U.S. President Donald Trump threatens further military action if Venezuela fails to fall in line. Nick Harper is covering this story for CNN live from New York. Nick, what could happen at this hearing?
Yeah, wait, so that court appearance getting underway in about 4.5 hours' time from now. Nicolás Maduro and his wife will be making that appearance to face 4 charges, including one of narco-terrorism. We are expecting this to be a brief appearance. It won't be really a long or lengthy opportunity to hear much from the Venezuelan leader, more just an opportunity for those charges to be read. He may get the chance to enter a plea, but that might come at a later date. And in many ways, this is just the beginning of what will be a very lengthy legal process that could drag on for months and months. And at the heart of this is whether or not Nicolás Maduro headed up a drug cartel, sending drugs into the United States, something that Donald Trump said affected U.S. national security. Trying to prove that, legal scholars have been suggesting over the weekend, could be very difficult, and his team is likely to mount a very sizable defence. He, of course, throughout all of this has maintained that he has not been heading up a drug cartel, that he has nothing to do with organised crime, and has certainly not been sending drugs into the United States. So that will be a challenging thing in order to prove, but I think the US prosecutors will be trying to frame all of this and the legality of carrying out that operation as really the US carrying out an arrest warrant against what they call a narco-terrorist. They say that this was not about removing the head of government. In that indictment, they called him the de facto but illegitimate leader. They say that they're serving that arrest warrant, and they see this as the beginning of that legal process to hold him accountable.
Well, Nick, Mr. Maduro facing that lengthy legal process, but Mr. Trump's administration also in the move to take him out of Caracas, facing scrutiny over the possible illegality of action like that. And that will be in focus when the UN Security Council meets today, later, for an emergency session.
That's right, that meeting in 2.5 hours' time in the UN just behind me here. And at heart will be the question of whether the United States is in violation of the UN Charter and the legality of that operation. We will see the 15 members of the Security Council hashing it out, the UN mounting a defence, while we hear from the likes of China and Russia, who both say that there has been illegal action, that they are very concerned about. China has called for the immediate release of Nicolás Maduro. Now, the United States say that they have not broken the UN Charter. This will be an expanded meeting. We'll also hear from other Latin American countries who are against what took place over the weekend, potentially hearing from the likes of Brazil and Cuba, but also Argentina, who has come out in support of the United States. Some of the US allies, though, have been somewhat more reticent. For example, France and the United Kingdom, they both sit on the Security Council as permanent members. We are not, however, expecting a resolution today, something that would be voted on. And of course, if it were voted on, the US would be voting that down with their veto power.
Oh, thanks, Nick Harper there reporting for CNA from New York. Well, we're joined by Drew Thompson, Senior Fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies from Nanyang Technological University. Thanks for coming in this evening.
Thank you for having me.
We just heard Nick Harper there talking about this emergency session later today, Singapore time, at the UN Security Council. Does it matter what the United Nations, even if they can vote on any resolution, does it matter?
At this point, not particularly. The deed is done. As a fundamental principle here, domestic law tends to supersede international law. And the UN Charter is very vague, has no enforcement mechanisms. It's effectively a debate society at this point. So the U.S. will participate in the debate along with other Security Council members. Whether a resolution comes to the table, whether it's voted on, whatever the outcome is, it won't change the outcomes whatsoever. I think the bottom line here is President Trump has put the international community on notice that U.S. national interests need to be respected and that they'll take extraordinary measures to defend the United States from these threats.
I think anyone who's keeping an eye on what's happening between the US and Venezuela would not see this as a surprise. Months of build-up. This was, in many ways, is a natural consequence of what has been happening. But accusations that this, as a foreign policy strategy, might not be quite as coherent as Mr. Trump might like to portray it to be. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think this was a pretty seminal moment for the Trump administration, and I think we have seen a fair amount of coherence here. The President put forward the national security strategy a few weeks ago that outlined the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, essentially asserting U.S. interests and assuring the region that the United States will protect those interests in the region and protect them aggressively. And I think the President has signaled that very clearly in his speeches and rhetoric as well as in the published strategy. So what we've seen here in this Venezuela intervention is really the execution of that strategy. It's not just a very effective military operation, it was a stunningly effective military operation. What we've seen is diplomacy, clear signaling, messaging. We've seen military pressure, political pressure, all placed on Venezuela incrementally. There were back-channel dialogues. He was given off-ramps, opportunities to avoid this consequence, and they were turned down. So when deterrence failed, when off-ramps failed, Trump administration was left with an extreme measure, and they pulled it off in a very dramatic fashion and achieved their goals. And I think that's an important signal about their resolve, about their commitment to execute their strategy aggressively, and should put to rest any doubts about the Trump administration's coherence and focus and ability to execute.
In line with that national security strategy that we saw just under a month ago, so I think 8th December last year, in which he made it very clear, this Monroe Doctrine, which in 1823 made it very clear the US has its sphere of influence, European powers at that point had their sphere of influence, each does not touch either's sphere of influence. Concerns now that a sphere of influence might take precedence over what many refer to, whether there's any truth in that now, as the global order and international law. Do you see spheres of influence taking precedence over laws that apply to all, whatever the sphere?
So I think it's important to think about the history of the Monroe Doctrine. It was written in a period where the United States was seeking to stop incursions in the region by Europe. It was intended to reduce colonial expansion in the region. And it struggled to actually carry it out at the time. So I think that's an important understanding to have, right? So part of it is about foreign interference in the region. Part of it's about protecting American interests. And I think that latter part is probably more central. China's certainly a factor here. It's a major investor, major trading partner of all these countries. In some cases, it's a security partner, as in the case of Venezuela, too. But I don't think this presages an era of necessarily spheres of influence. The United States is going to protect its interests in the Western Hemisphere more assertively, and I think that's clear. But that doesn't mean that the Trump administration is conceding a sphere of influence to China, for example, in the Asia-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is still an established power and has access and influence and isn't prepared to give it up and is going to continue to seek dominance there as well.
Well, since you mentioned China, for anyone who is suggesting this might be a signal to China, is Beijing going to be reading this as you can do as you like because you can, so will I? Or might it read it as we need to be careful because you might do the same should you feel justified?
Well, I think China does what it wants when it can. And it can also take liberties with international rules and norms and laws as well. And that's a prerogative of not just great powers, but small countries as well, because international law is inherently weak. I think from China's perspective, maybe from Xi Jinping specifically, I think this reinforces something he discovered in the first Trump administration in 2017, when in the midst of a bilateral dialogue over dinner at Mar-a-Lago, President Trump informed Xi Jinping he had just conducted military strikes in Syria over their use of chemical weapons against their own people, which is a violation of international law. So I think Xi Jinping is pretty clear that Trump is not gun-shy, that he has resolve, and that he has the means to use military force to further U.S. interests. I think there's a couple of other takeaways potentially for China. I don't think this gives China a free license to expand a sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific. It certainly is a warning about the extent of Chinese investments and relationships in the Western Hemisphere. I think the Trump corollary doesn't necessarily preclude normal trade relationships between China and Western Hemisphere countries, but it should put them on notice that certain strategic investments, military operations, military cooperation, security cooperation is potentially unacceptable to the Trump administration, and there will be consequences. So if China were to start approaching Latin American states about bases, that would certainly be a major cause for concern for the Trump administration, and I think something that they would push back quite hard on. So this is a new paradigm in many ways that China is going to have to adapt to, but it's not going to preclude them from having trade relationships and making normal investments in those countries as well.
Oh, thanks for that. Drew Thompson there, a senior fellow from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies from NTU right here in Singapore. Thank you.